So, Christopher Nolan is arguably the most interesting director of the 21st century. I mean, sure, Danny Boyle's had some interesting films, and Scorsese is still plugging away on Netflix, but I would argue that Nolan is the one that inspires the most passion. And the reason I would argue that is because if people like films, they generally like Christopher Nolan films, but they don't like all of his films. They can be polarizing. So you might find someone who loves Inception but hates Interstellar, or alternatively, you might find someone who thinks Inception is confusing but on the other hand thinks Dunkirk is an absolute masterpiece. So for me, I'm not crazy about either Dunkirk or Tenet. I don't hate them. I would rather watch Christopher Nolan's failures than pretty much any other modern film. And I think Oppenheimer is going to develop a similarly polarizing reputation. It is absolutely brilliant. It's 3 hours long, and to be honest, at the end, I still wanted more. I didn't want it to finish. I mean, it's a 3 hour movie about a physicist. It does have the atomic bomb, but it's very much a character study. It's a 3 hour contemplation. It's a meditation. It's a movie to be experienced and thought about afterwards. I realise that some people aren't going to like that. I personally really liked it a lot. So Cillian Murphy is playing Robert Oppenheimer, the man who directed the Manhattan Project, which produced the first nuclear weapons, which ended World War II and started the nuclear age that we live in today. And it's a fantastic performance. He captures the physicality, the baggy suits, the contemplative look on his face, and gives a really interesting portrayal of this man who lives in a world of science, who understands the quantum world in a way that very few people actually do. On the flip side, the film portrays him as extremely naive about the political context in which he operates. So the film begins in the 1920s, the 1930s, and sets up his personal motivation for developing the bomb. It's because he's Jewish. A lot of the people who developed quantum physics were Jewish. And as the 1930s went on, Jews obviously became more and more worried that the threat that Germany posed to them. And this led Oppenheimer towards communism. He was kind of portrayed as intellectually flirting with communism. He denies being a communist. And it's portrayed in the film that he did this out of a sense partly of self-preservation and partly that he was just too naive to see how this would be interpreted by the American government in terms of how many communists wanted to spread communist government across the world. So he has many friends who are communists. He has many colleagues who are as well. He has a lover who is communist. And he's open to the idea of sharing scientific research with the Russians. And until very late in the story, doesn't understand why that would be a problem for people who work in government, why that makes him look suspicious and unreliable in many people's eyes. So Oppenheimer is a scientific genius who brings quantum physics to America, but in other areas of his life, he's extremely fallible. And Matt Damon, playing General Gross, outlines this in detail when Oppenheimer is offered the directorship of the Manhattan Project. So an ongoing theme of the movie is Oppenheimer's struggles with his security clearance, earlier in the film actually gaining the security clearance because of the nature of his friendships and relationships, and the fact that he holds back information from the government. For example, when he's approached to share information with the Russians illegally, and then doesn't tell the American government about this approach for a substantial amount of time. There's a fantastic cameo by Casey Affleck, and the government had good reason to be fearful about this prospect because there was at least one Russian spy working on the Manhattan Project, so the fears are founded. Basically, the people who built the atomic bomb are portrayed as unreliable geniuses, and then after the war, once the technology is developed, it gets taken away from the geniuses and into the hands of the bureaucrats. Oppenheimer changes the world, but he realizes too late that he's changed it in ways that he doesn't like. He spends the post-war period trying to influence nuclear policy and sometimes being successful, but eventually he gets sidelined by a bureaucrat, played by Robert Downey JR., who He humiliates in public, but revenge is taken several years later. The actors are extremely good. Cillian Murphy, Matt Damon, Florence Pugh, Emily Blunt, Robert Downey Jr., they all knock it out of the park. They give great performances. The visuals, how they see what's going on in Oppenheimer's head about the Trinity test itself are spectacular. Visually, this is everything you expect from a Christopher Nolan film, but it's not really worth seeing in IMAX. The centre of the movie, of course, is Cillian Murphy, with these long, lingering shots while he stares into the distance, smokes a cigarette. We don't know what he's thinking. How could we know what the man who created the atomic bomb, the man who gave our species the ability to end itself, how could we know what he's thinking? The film highlights a central paradox of scientific advancement. It's the geniuses who move it forward, the erratic geniuses, but then the boring government bureaucrats who take it and twist it in ways that the geniuses never intended. It's about changing reality and changing perceptions by Oppenheimer, perceptions of Oppenheimer, and I think this is why Nolan adapted this book and made this movie, because Nolan is interested in perceptions and reality. It goes throughout many of his films. For all that this is a film that concentrates on hard science, the movie that it reminds me of is The Prestige. It's got the same sort of magical, fantastical ideas, or characters that have magical, fantastical, unreal ideas. It has these visualizations of Oppenheimer thinking about quantum physics, thinking about reality on a magical level that most people just don't get. And we also see Oppenheimer living in the real world and being incredibly naive about the politics of his time, about who the people around him are, about what the US government thinks. We see Oppenheimer thinking that the mere building of the bomb is the culmination of the project. He doesn't seem to realise until very late that they're actually going to drop it. We see him thinking that this will advance the pacifist cause. We see him thinking no actual nuclear weapons will be built because the sheer horror of it, and obviously looking back, this seems extremely naive. In the post-war sections of the films, we see Robert Downey Jr. as Louis Strauss manipulating the machinery of the United States government to remove Oppenheimer's security clearance and humiliate him. Again, manipulating perception and reality. We see Oppenheimer regretful of the work that he's done. What does a person do after they invent a nuclear bomb? How do you live with that knowledge? How do you present yourself to other people, knowing what humans can do? They can now end the species. For me, the way Oppenheimer is presented in this movie, he reminds me of Harvey Dent in The Dark Knight. But whereas in The Dark Knight, Commissioner Gordon and Batman cover up Harvey Dent's crimes, here Oppenheimer is presented in public. He is on the cover of Time magazine, presented as the father of the nuclear age, while at the same time everyone knows the horror of the bomb that he created. In the same scene that we see Cillian Murphy on the front of Time magazine, we also see Oppenheimer talking to the president about his moral qualms and being dismissed as a crybaby. And if The Dark Knight offers a comparison to Oppenheimer, I think another Nolan film, Memento, offers a contrast. Guy Pearce plays the main character Leonard Shelby with irreparable memory loss. He is doomed to forget his errors, and by the end of that movie we see that maybe he should forget, but in contrast we have Oppenheimer who can't forget, who has to live with what he's done, and he's constantly told that he did the right thing, while at the same time being constantly pilloried for his character flaws. So yeah, it's a 3-hour movie about a physicist. Not everyone will like it, but it's absolutely fantastic. And it is not just Cillian Murphy. Emily Blunt is a standout. Florence Pugh is great. Not sure the nudity was necessary, but it's very welcome. Matt Damon and Robert Downey Jr. and briefly Gary Oldman as well. So if you're up for a movie to just sit back and experience, then I would recommend Oppenheimer. Thanks for watching.